The unexpected visitor. The icy winds howled through the vast snowy plains of Aurora 5, a remote planet known for its harsh winters and rare wildlife. John Carter, a human researcher, sat alone in his wooden cabin. The cabin was small but cozy, with a roaring fireplace and shelves lined with books and tools. He had been stationed here for months, studying the planet's unique ecosystem. The isolation was challenging, but he had grown used to it. As the evening turned darker, a fierce blizzard swept across the landscape. Snow piled up against the cabin walls, and the windows rattled under the wind's strength. John sat at his desk, scribbling notes about his latest findings. The sound of the storm outside made the cabin feel even quieter. Suddenly, there was a loud knock on the door. John froze. He wasn't expecting anyone. No one ever came out this far, especially in a storm like this. Another knock echoed through the cabin, louder and more urgent this time. Who could it be? He whispered to himself, his heart pounding. Grabbing a flashlight, he walked cautiously to the door. The snowstorm outside made it difficult to see anything through the frosted window. Taking a deep breath, he unlatched the door and pulled it open. Standing there was the most extraordinary being he had ever seen. She was tall, nearly 7 feet, with shimmering scales that reflected the light like polished silver. Her eyes glowed a soft green, piercing through the darkness. She was wrapped in a strange, translucent fabric that seemed inadequate for the freezing temperatures. Her delicate features were both alien and breathtakingly beautiful. "Please," she said in a melodic voice, her breath visible in the cold air. "I need shelter." John hesitated for a moment, but her trembling figure convinced him. "Come in," he said, stepping aside to let her enter. The alien woman stepped inside, her movements graceful despite the exhaustion evident on her face. As she crossed the threshold, John felt an odd tingle in the air, as if her presence changed the atmosphere of the cabin. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft but steady. John quickly shut the door behind her, sealing out the storm. "You shouldn't be out in weather like this. Are you hurt?" She shook her head, though her breathing was labored. "My name is Lyra. My ship crashed nearby. The storm, it destroyed my beacon. I've been walking for hours." John stared at her in disbelief. A shipwreck? He hadn't seen any signs of one. But with the storm raging outside, it was possible he had missed it. "You're lucky to be alive," he said, motioning for her to sit by the fire. "Here, warm up." Lyra nodded, lowering herself onto a chair near the fireplace. Her movements were elegant but carried a weight of exhaustion. John noticed her hands, 3 slender fingers with glowing tips, unlike anything he had ever seen before. "Thank you, human," she said after a moment, her voice carrying an almost musical quality. "John," he corrected her. "My name is John Carter. And you're?" "Lyra," she repeated, looking into the flames. "I'm from the planet Serene. I was traveling through this system when my ship malfunctioned. The storm forced me to land here." John nodded, trying to process the situation. He had met aliens before. Aurora 5 was a hub for research missions from various species, but Lyra was different. She wasn't just another traveler. There was something mysterious about her, something he couldn't quite place. As the fire crackled, John handed her a blanket and a mug of hot water. She accepted both with a faint smile. "What were you doing out there?" he asked, sitting across from her. "This storm could have killed you." "I had no choice," she replied, her voice tinged with sadness. "My kind, we have certain needs during this time of year. If I stayed too long in my damaged ship, it would have been dangerous, for me and anyone nearby." John raised an eyebrow. "Needs? What kind of needs?" Lyra hesitated, her glowing eyes meeting his. "It's complicated. For now, I only need rest. Thank you for your kindness, John." Her answer left him with more questions than answers, but he decided not to press further. She was clearly exhausted, and the storm outside wasn't letting up. He could hear the wind howling and snow piling higher against the cabin walls. John stood and checked the locks on the door and windows, making sure everything was secure. For a brief moment, he thought he saw something moving in the shadows outside, a large shape, almost humanoid. But when he looked closer, it was gone. "Probably just my imagination," he muttered to himself. As he returned to his seat, Lyra had closed her eyes, leaning back in the chair. Her breathing had slowed, and she looked almost peaceful. Yet there was an air of tension in the room, an unspoken sense that her arrival was just the beginning of something far more complicated. John sat silently, watching the firelight dance across the room. He couldn't shake the feeling that Lyra's presence was going to change everything. And he was right. Strange behaviors. The next morning, the storm still raged outside, blanketing the planet in an endless sea of white. John woke to the faint crackling of the fireplace, its warmth a welcome contrast to the biting cold. He rubbed his eyes and stretched, but as his senses sharpened, he realized something was off. Lyra was sitting in the far corner of the room, her glowing green eyes fixed intently on him. Good morning," John said, his voice unsure. Lyra tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. She didn't respond immediately, and for a moment, John wondered if she had understood him. Then she blinked, and her lips curved into a faint smile. "Good morning," she said, her voice calm but carrying an eerie edge. John shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "How are you feeling?" "Better than last night." She stood gracefully, her movements almost too fluid, like water flowing uphill. "Yes, much better. Your fire and hospitality have restored my strength." "Thank you, John Carter." Hearing her use his full name gave him an odd chill, but he brushed it off. "Good to hear. I was worried about you. You seemed pretty out of it." Lyra didn't respond. Instead, she walked toward the window, her gaze fixed on the swirling snowstorm outside. John noticed her fingertips glowing faintly, tracing the frost-covered glass. "Are you thinking about your ship?" he asked, trying to break the silence. "Yes," she said without turning around. "And other things." John frowned. "What other things?" Lyra turned to face him, her glowing eyes locking onto his. "You, for example." He blinked. "Me? You are fascinating," she said, her voice almost reverent. "Your physiology, your behavior, even the way your thoughts scatter when you speak to me. I've never encountered a species quite like yours." John chuckled nervously. "Well, humans are pretty unique, I guess, but you're the one who's fascinating. I've never seen anyone like you either." Lyra stepped closer, her movements so silent that John barely noticed until she was standing only a few feet away. Her gaze was intense, studying him as if he were a puzzle she couldn't solve. "What's your species like?" he asked, trying to steer the conversation. Lyra's expression shifted, and for the first time, John thought he saw hesitation. "We are complex," she said finally. "Our biology is tied closely to the rhythms of the universe. Certain times, certain cycles, they affect us deeply." John raised an eyebrow. "Sounds mystical." She smiled faintly. "Perhaps it is, or perhaps it is simply science you have yet to understand." Before John could ask more, Lyra reached out suddenly, her hand hovering inches from his chest. "May I?" she asked softly. John hesitated. "May you? What?" "Feel your heartbeat," she said. "It's a curiosity of mine." He felt a strange mix of unease and intrigue. Sure, I guess." Lyra pressed her fingertips gently against his chest. Her skin was cool to the touch, and the glow from her fingers seemed to pulse in time with his heartbeat. Her eyes fluttered closed, and for a moment, she looked almost serene. "Strong," she murmured. "Steady. Your species is resilient." "Thanks, I guess," John said, trying to mask his discomfort. Lyra stepped back, her hand dropping to her side. "You should be proud of your kind," she said, her voice distant. "Your strength, it is rare." John didn't know how to respond to that. He watched as she moved around the cabin, examining his belongings. She picked up a small metallic tool from his workbench, turning it over in her hands like it was a priceless artifact. "What is this?" she asked. "A thermal spanner," John said. "It's used to fix heating systems. Pretty basic stuff." Lyra's fingers ran along the tool's surface, her eyes narrowing. "Basic to you. Remarkable to me." Her fascination with even the simplest objects unsettled John. It wasn't just curiosity. There was something else in her gaze, something deeper and more intense. As the day wore on, Lyra's behavior grew stranger. She mimicked John's movements when he ate, her head tilting in the exact same way. She asked endless questions about human emotions, focusing especially on concepts like love, fear, and instinct. At one point, she leaned in close and whispered, "Do you ever feel like you are not in control of yourself?" The question sent a shiver down his spine. "Not really." "Why do you ask?" Lyra didn't answer. Instead, she turned away, her glowing eyes dimming slightly as if retreating into her own thoughts. That night, as John lay in bed, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The cabin felt too quiet, even with the storm raging outside. He stared at the ceiling, trying to convince himself that Lyra was just an alien with unusual habits. But just as sleep began to claim him, he heard a faint noise, a soft, rhythmic vibration coming from the other side of the cabin. Sitting up, he squinted into the darkness. Lyra was standing in the corner again, her back to him. The vibrations grew stronger, almost like a hum, and he realized they were coming from her. "Lyra," he called out. She didn't move. "Are you okay?" He tried again, his voice edged with worry. Slowly, she turned to face him. Her glowing eyes were brighter than ever, and her expression was unreadable. For the first time, John felt a flicker of fear. "I am adjusting," she said cryptically. John had no idea what that meant, but he knew one thing for certain. Lyra wasn't just a stranded traveler. Something else was happening, something he couldn't yet understand. A shocking revelation. The blizzard outside showed no signs of relenting, its icy winds howling against the cabin walls like a living beast. Inside, the air felt unnaturally heavy, almost suffocating. John sat at his workbench, tinkering with a damaged communication device, hoping to establish some kind of contact with the outside world. Lyra sat silently across the room, her glowing green eyes fixed on the fire, the flickering flames reflected in her iridescent scales. John had spent the better part of the day trying to keep himself busy, but Lyra's presence was becoming increasingly unsettling. Her behavior, though polite and calm on the surface, carried an undercurrent of something John couldn't quite place, something that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. "Lyra," John said, breaking the silence, "do you think your people will come looking for you?" Her eyes flicked to him, her expression unreadable. "Unlikely," she replied, her voice softer than usual. "The storm has disrupted all signals, and even if they could detect me, they would know better than to approach during this time." John set down his tools and turned to face her. "This time? What do you mean?" Lyra hesitated, her glowing fingers tracing patterns on the edge of the table. "My species," she began, her voice carrying a strange mix of pride and unease, "has a unique biological cycle. Once every orbital year, we experience changes." John frowned. "What kind of changes?" She stood abruptly, her movements fluid yet tense, like a predator stalking prey. "Our instincts become heightened. Our bodies prepare for survival, for continuation. It is a time when we are both at our strongest and our most vulnerable." John's unease deepened. "Are you saying this is happening to you right now?" Lyra turned to him, her glowing eyes boring into his. "Yes," she said simply. "It has already begun." A cold knot of dread settled in John's stomach. He leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. "What does that mean for me?" She took a step closer, her tall frame casting a shadow over him despite the firelight. "It means I am fighting a battle within myself," she said, her voice low. "Your kind, humans, you emit signals, pheromones, hormones, energy. My body responds to them." John's eyes widened. "Wait, are you saying my presence is making this worse?" "Yes," she admitted, her voice tinged with guilt. "I did not anticipate this. Humans are rare where I come from. I didn't know. I couldn't have known how strongly my instincts would react to you." John stood, backing away instinctively. "So what happens now? Are you going to attack me or something?" Lyra shook her head, her glowing eyes dimming slightly. "No," she said firmly. "I am still in control. But the longer I remain near you, the harder it becomes." John's heart raced. He tried to process what she was saying, but it felt like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. "Why didn't you tell me this sooner?" "I thought I could manage it," she said, her voice laced with frustration. At herself, perhaps, or at the situation. "But your kindness, your proximity, it accelerates the process. I cannot fight it forever." John rubbed his temples, trying to think clearly. "Is there a way to stop it?" "I don't know, reverse it." Lyra hesitated, then shook her head. "It is a natural cycle. It cannot be stopped. Only endured." "Endured," John repeated, his voice rising. "For how long?" "Days," she said. "Perhaps a week. It depends on many factors." John stared at her, his mind spinning with questions and fears. He wanted to help her. She was clearly suffering, but he couldn't ignore the growing sense of danger. As if sensing his turmoil, Lyra took a step back, giving him space. "I will not harm you, John Carter," she said softly. "I promise you that." But her words did little to ease his nerves. He had seen the way her eyes glowed brighter whenever she looked at him, the way her body seemed to vibrate with barely contained energy. Suddenly, a low, rumbling noise broke the tense silence. It wasn't coming from the storm. It was deeper, almost guttural. John's eyes darted to the window. What the hell was that? Lyra stiffened, her glowing scales shimmering in the firelight. "Something is outside," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. John grabbed a flashlight and moved cautiously to the window. The glass was frosted over, but he could make out a large, shadowy figure moving through the storm. It was big, bigger than anything he'd ever seen on Aurora 5. "What is it?" he asked, his voice trembling. Lyra's expression darkened. "A predator," she said, "drawn to the pheromones I emit during this time." John felt the blood drain from his face. "You're telling me that thing is here because of you?" "Yes," she said, her tone grim, "and it will not stop until it reaches me." The rumbling noise grew louder, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps crunching through the snow. John turned to Lyra, panic rising in his chest. "What do we do?" She met his gaze, her glowing eyes burning with determination. "We survive," she said. "But you must trust me. No matter what happens, do not leave this cabin." John wasn't sure he could trust her, especially now, but he had no choice. The creature outside was getting closer, and the fragile safety of the cabin felt like it could shatter at any moment. For the first time, John realized just how dangerous Lyra's presence truly was. But as much as he wanted to send her away, he knew he couldn't. She was as much a victim of her biology as he was of circumstance. As the creature's shadow loomed closer, John gritted his teeth and prepared for whatever was about to come. The ticking clock. The creature's guttural growl reverberated through the walls of the cabin, louder and more menacing with each passing moment. John crouched by the window, his breath fogging up the glass as he strained to see through the snowstorm. The shadow outside was massive, its movements slow but deliberate. "Is it circling us?" he whispered, glancing back at Lyra. She stood near the fireplace, her tall frame tense and glowing faintly in the dim light. Her green eyes flicked toward the window, and she nodded. "It's testing us." Observing. John's chest tightened. Testing us for what? Weakness. Lyra's gaze locked onto his. No, it's waiting for an opportunity to strike. It knows I'm here, and it knows I'm vulnerable. John swallowed hard. The idea of her being vulnerable was unsettling. She was clearly stronger and more advanced than him. If this thing posed a threat to her, what chance did he have? Grabbing his rifle from the corner of the cabin, he checked its charge. The weapon was designed for small predators native to Aurora 5, but against something that size, he wasn't sure it would even make a dent. "Stay inside," Lyra said sharply, her voice cutting through his thoughts. "What are you planning to do?" John asked, his grip tightening on the rifle. Lyra's glowing scales shimmered faintly, a ripple of energy coursing through her body. "If I confront it, I may be able to drive it away. My kind are formidable when provoked." "And what happens if you can't drive it away?" John asked, his tone laced with skepticism. Her silence spoke volumes. John shook his head. "No, we stay here, together. I don't care how strong you are. Walking out into that storm with that thing out there is suicide." Lyra's gaze softened for a moment, a flicker of gratitude passing across her alien features. "Then we need a plan," she said. "A desperate preparation. The cabin wasn't designed for defense. It was a simple wooden structure meant to house a lone researcher and his equipment." As the rumbling outside grew louder, John and Lyra worked quickly to fortify their position. John dragged a heavy table in front of the door, while Lyra secured the windows, her strength making the task look effortless. Despite the gravity of the situation, John couldn't help but notice how her movements seemed to grow more fluid and precise as the minutes ticked by. "Are you changing?" he asked cautiously as she reinforced the window shutters. Lyra paused, her glowing fingers tightening on the wooden frame. "Yes," she admitted. "The longer I remain near you, the stronger the effects of the cycle become. My instincts are sharpening, my senses heightening." "And that's a good thing, right?" John asked, hoping for some reassurance. Lyra didn't answer. Instead, she turned her attention back to the window, her glowing eyes scanning the storm for any sign of the predator. The silence between them was heavy, broken only by the howling wind and the distant growl of the creature outside. The first attack. The sound of claws scraping against the cabin door shattered the tense quiet. John froze, his grip tightening on the rifle as his heart pounded in his chest. "It's here," Lyra said, her voice calm but firm. The creature let out a deafening roar, the sheer force of the sound making the walls tremble. John backed away from the door, his mind racing. "What is that thing?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "A predator," Lyra said, her glowing eyes narrowing. "Drawn to my pheromones. It won't leave until it has me, or until it's dead." John's stomach churned. "Dead? How do we even kill something like that?" Before Lyra could respond, the door buckled under a powerful blow. Splinters flew across the room, and a deep crack formed in the wood. "Get back," John shouted, raising his rifle. The door burst open, and the creature lunged inside. It was massive, its body covered in thick, black fur that shimmered with an unnatural sheen. Its eyes glowed a fierce red, and its elongated jaws dripped with saliva. John fired a shot, the blast lighting up the room for a brief moment. The bolt of energy struck the creature's shoulder, causing it to roar in pain, but it barely slowed down. "Your weapons are ineffective," Lyra shouted, stepping in front of John. "What are you doing?" he yelled, panic gripping him. Lyra's entire body began to glow, her scales radiating an intense light. The air around her seemed to hum with energy, and her presence became almost overwhelming. The creature hesitated, its glowing red eyes narrowing as it assessed her. "Leave," Lyra commanded, her voice resonating with an unnatural power. For a moment, it seemed like the creature might retreat, but then it roared again, lunging at her with terrifying speed. A narrow escape. Lyra moved faster than John thought possible. She sidestepped the creature's attack, her glowing hand striking its side with a burst of energy. The impact sent the beast crashing into the wall, but it quickly recovered, snarling as it prepared for another strike. "John, go!" Lyra shouted, her voice filled with urgency. "I'm not leaving you," he yelled back, firing another shot at the creature. This time, the blast hit its leg, causing it to stumble. Lyra took advantage of the moment, grabbing John's arm and pulling him toward the back of the cabin. "We need to get to the outpost," she said. "It's the only place we can fortify against this thing." "The outpost is miles away," John protested. "Do you have a better idea?" Lyra snapped, her glowing eyes flashing with intensity. Realizing she was right, John grabbed a backpack filled with essential supplies. Together, they burst out the back door, the storm immediately enveloping them in a blinding swirl of snow and wind. Behind them, the creature let out a furious roar, its heavy footsteps following close behind. "Keep moving," Lyra shouted, her voice barely audible over the storm. John pushed forward, his heart pounding as the predator's growls grew louder. The storm was their only cover, but it was also their greatest obstacle. Every step felt like a battle against the elements, the freezing wind cutting through John's coat like knives. As they stumbled through the snow, John couldn't help but glance at Lyra. Despite the storm, she moved with purpose, her glowing form cutting through the darkness like a beacon. For the first time, John felt a glimmer of hope. If anyone could get them through this, it was her. But as the predator's shadow loomed closer, he knew their fight was far from over. The clock was ticking, and their survival depended on every decision they made in the next few moments. Escape into the wild. The storm raged around them, a swirling vortex of ice and wind that made every step feel like an impossible struggle. John stumbled forward, clutching his rifle in one hand and the strap of his backpack in the other. Lyra moved ahead of him, her glowing form cutting through the darkness like a phantom, her footsteps barely leaving a mark on the snow. Behind them, the creature roared, a deep guttural sound that sent a shiver down John's spine. He glanced over his shoulder and caught a glimpse of its massive shadow, its glowing red eyes piercing through the white chaos of the blizzard. "Keep moving," Lyra shouted, her voice barely audible over the howling wind. John gritted his teeth and pushed forward. His lungs burned from the cold, and his legs felt like lead, but the primal fear of the creature chasing them kept him going. "How much farther to the outpost?" he yelled, his voice hoarse. Lyra slowed for a moment, turning to look at him. "Another mile, maybe 2, she said. "But the storm is making it harder to navigate." John swore under his breath. A mile felt like an eternity in this freezing wasteland, especially with the predator closing in. Suddenly, Lyra stopped, her glowing eyes scanning the area. She held up a hand, signaling John to halt. "What is it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she tilted her head, as if listening to something he couldn't hear. The faint hum of her glowing scales grew louder, and John realized she was tapping into some instinctual sense. "It's circling us," she said finally, her voice tense. John tightened his grip on the rifle. "What do we do?" Lyra's eyes met his, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of doubt in her usually calm demeanor. "We need to draw it away from the path to the outpost. If it follows us there, we'll be trapped." "Draw it away? How?" John asked, his voice rising with panic. Lyra stepped closer, her glowing form almost shielding him from the storm. "You'll keep heading toward the outpost. I'll lead it in the opposite direction." "No way," John said immediately. "I'm not leaving you out here alone with that thing." "You don't have a choice," she said firmly. "It's me it wants. I'm the reason it's hunting us. If I don't distract it, we're both dead." John shook his head, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. "There has to be another way." "There isn't," Lyra said, her tone softening. "But I promise, I'll meet you at the outpost. Trust me, John Carter." Her glowing hand reached out and rested briefly on his shoulder. Despite the cold, her touch felt warm, almost comforting. John wanted to argue, to come up with some miracle plan that didn't involve splitting up. But deep down, he knew she was right. "Fine," he said reluctantly, "but you better make it back." Lyra's lips curved into a faint smile. "I will." The chase begins. Lyra turned and sprinted into the storm, her glowing form quickly disappearing into the white haze. Moments later, the predator let out a furious roar and charged after her, its massive form crashing through the snow with terrifying speed. John stood frozen for a moment, the silence left in their wake almost deafening. Then he forced himself to move, his boots crunching through the snow as he made his way toward the outpost. Every step felt like a battle against the storm. The wind whipped at his face, and the freezing cold seeped through his thick coat. He glanced at his wrist-mounted GPS, but the storm's interference made the device unreliable. "Just keep going," he muttered to himself, "one step at a time." The sound of the predator's roars grew fainter as he moved farther away, but the sense of danger never left him. The storm was unrelenting, and the snowdrifts were getting deeper, making it harder to move. After what felt like an eternity, he spotted a faint light in the distance. His heart leaped. The outpost. The outpost. The structure was small but sturdy, built to withstand the harsh conditions of Aurora 5. John stumbled toward it, his legs trembling with exhaustion. He reached the door and fumbled with the keypad, his fingers numb from the cold. Finally, the door slid open, and he collapsed inside, the sudden warmth of the interior hitting him like a wave. He took a moment to catch his breath, then slammed the door shut and activated the locking mechanism. The outpost was equipped with basic supplies, a heater, a small generator, and a communication terminal. John set down his rifle and shrugged off his backpack, his body aching from the trek. He immediately went to the terminal and tried to establish a signal. The screen flickered, but the storm's interference made it impossible to connect to the main network. "Damn it," he muttered, slamming his fist against the console. His thoughts quickly turned to Lyra. She had bought him time, but at what cost? He paced the room, glancing nervously at the door. The hum of the generator was the only sound, but it did little to calm his nerves. After what felt like hours, there was a loud thud against the door. John froze, his heart pounding. He grabbed his rifle and aimed it at the entrance. "Lyra," he called out, his voice trembling. The thud came again, followed by a faint, melodic voice. "John, it's me." He hesitated for a moment, then moved cautiously to the door. Peering through the small window, he saw Lyra's glowing form on the other side. He quickly unlocked the door and pulled her inside. She stumbled forward, her shimmering scales dimmer than before, her breathing labored. "You made it," he said, relief flooding through him. She nodded weakly. "The predator. It's still out there, but I bought us some time." John helped her to a chair and grabbed a blanket, wrapping it around her shoulders. "What do we do now?" Lyra looked up at him, her glowing eyes filled with determination. "We prepare, because it's not over yet." A dangerous bond. The outpost was eerily silent, save for the low hum of the generator keeping the lights on. John stood by the small observation window, his rifle clutched tightly in his hands. Outside, the storm still raged, but he could see faint shadows moving in the swirling snow. "It's still out there," he muttered, his breath fogging up the cold glass. Behind him, Lyra sat slumped in a chair, her normally luminous scales dim and pale. She looked drained, her breathing shallow, as if the effort to lead the predator away had cost her more than she let on. John turned to her, his worry growing. "How long do we have before it finds us again?" Lyra lifted her head slowly, her glowing green eyes meeting his. "Not long. It won't stop until it gets what it wants." "And what does it want?" John asked, though he already knew the answer. "Me," she said simply. "My biology, my pheromones. They act like a beacon. It's instinctual for the predator to hunt me during this cycle. John sighed and leaned against the wall, his mind racing. So, what do? We can't outrun it again. And if it breaches this place, we're as good as dead. There is one option, Lyra said, her voice hesitant. John looked at her sharply. I'm listening. She stood slowly, her movements graceful despite her exhaustion. There's a way to suppress the effects of my cycle temporarily. It will weaken the signal I'm emitting and confuse the predator. How? Lyra gestured to a small storage locker in the corner of the outpost. These research stations often carry basic chemical supplies. If we can create a suppressant compound, it might buy us time to call for help. John frowned. You want me to cook up some alien biochemistry suppressor with whatever scraps I can find here? You're a researcher, aren't you? She said, a faint smile playing on her lips. He shook his head, half amused, half exasperated. Yeah, but I study ecosystems, not alien mating cycles. It doesn't have to be perfect, Lyra said, her tone serious. Just enough to mask my presence. A desperate experiment. John rummaged through the storage locker, pulling out containers of chemicals and tools he barely recognized. The station's database offered some rudimentary instructions for creating compounds, but most of the information was too basic or irrelevant. Meanwhile, Lyra sat by the generator, her glowing eyes dimming further. John could see the strain on her face, the way her hands trembled slightly as she rested them on her knees. How much time do we have? He asked without looking up. An hour, maybe less, she replied. John swore under his breath and worked faster, mixing chemicals and hoping he wasn't about to blow them both up. The faint smell of ozone filled the air as he heated a small beaker over a portable flame. What happens if this doesn't work? He asked, breaking the tense silence. Lyra was quiet for a moment before answering. Then I'll go outside and face it, alone. Not happening, John said immediately. She looked at him, her expression unreadable. John, I appreciate your bravery, but this isn't your fight. I brought this danger to you. And you think I'm just going to let you walk out there to die? He shot back. Not a chance. Her lips curved into a faint smile. Humans are remarkable. You care so deeply, even for those who are not your own. Yeah, well, call it a flaw, he muttered, focusing on the mixture in front of him. The connection deepens. As John worked, Lyra moved closer, watching him with a curious intensity. Her glowing eyes followed every movement of his hands, and she seemed almost mesmerized. Why are you helping me? She asked softly. John glanced at her, surprised by the question. What do you mean? You needed help. Isn't that reason enough? For humans, perhaps, she said, but where I come from, such kindness is rare. Most would see me as a threat, especially in this state. Well, not most people, John said with a small shrug. Lyra tilted her head, studying him. No, you're not. The way she said it made him pause. There was something in her voice, an undertone of respect, maybe even admiration. The suppressor's price. After what felt like an eternity, John held up the completed mixture. The liquid inside the vial shimmered faintly, a pale blue color that seemed almost alive. This is it, he said, his voice heavy with both relief and uncertainty. At least, I think it is. Lyra took the vial from him, her glowing fingers brushing against his. Thank you, she said, her voice filled with sincerity. What happens now? He asked. I drink this, she said, holding up the vial. If it works, my pheromones will weaken, and the predator will lose interest. But what? It may also suppress other functions, she admitted. My strength, my senses. If the predator still finds us, I'll be less able to fight it. John's stomach twisted. So it's a gamble. Yes, she said simply. He nodded, his jaw tightening. Then we'll just have to make sure it doesn't come to a fight. Lyra smiled faintly and raised the vial to her lips. She drank it in one smooth motion, her glowing eyes flickering briefly before dimming further. She swayed slightly, and John caught her arm, steadying her. "Are you okay?" he asked. "I'll be fine," she said, though her voice sounded weaker. Now we wait. The predator returns. The silence that followed was unbearable. Every creak of the outpost, every gust of wind outside, made John's nerves fray further. Lyra sat slumped in a chair, her glowing eyes half closed as the suppressant took effect. Then it came, a deep, resonant growl that seemed to shake the walls. "It's here," John whispered, gripping his rifle tightly. The predator's shadow loomed outside the window, its glowing red eyes scanning the interior of the outpost. John held his breath, praying the suppressant had worked. The creature growled again, its massive claws scraping against the metal door. It sniffed the air, its movements slow and deliberate. John's heart pounded in his chest as he raised the rifle, ready to fire if it breached the door. Beside him, Lyra stirred, her eyes fluttering open. "Wait," she said weakly. "It might leave." The creature let out a low rumble, its red eyes narrowing. For a moment, it seemed to hesitate, its massive form shifting uncertainly. Then, with a final snarl, it turned and disappeared into the storm. John let out a shaky breath, his grip on the rifle loosening. "It worked," he said, relief flooding through him. Lyra managed a faint smile. "For now." But even as the danger seemed to pass, John couldn't shake the feeling that their fight was far from over. The predator might have retreated, but it wasn't gone. And with Lyra's strength fading, their odds of survival were growing slimmer by the minute. The final stand. The storm had quieted, but the tension inside the outpost was suffocating. The predator had retreated into the shadows, but John knew it wasn't gone. It was waiting, circling, and studying them. Every creak of the outpost walls, every faint sound from outside, felt like a warning that their time was running out. Lyra sat slumped in the chair, her glowing eyes barely flickering. The suppressant had dulled her strength and senses, just as she predicted. Her once luminous scales were dim, and her breathing was shallow. John paced the small space, his rifle clutched tightly in his hands. "It's not going to leave us alone, is it?" he said, breaking the heavy silence. "No," Lyra replied softly, her voice weak but steady. "It knows I'm still here. It can feel me, even with the suppressant." John stopped pacing and turned to her, his jaw tightening. "Then we make our stand here, together." Lyra's lips curved into a faint smile. "You're stubborn, John Carter. And you're lucky I am," he shot back. "Now tell me everything I need to know about this thing. Weaknesses, behavior, anything we can use against it." Lyra closed her eyes for a moment, gathering her thoughts. "The predator is strong, fast, and intelligent. It hunts with precision, using its senses to track its prey. But it's also territorial. If it feels threatened, it won't back down. We'll need to hit it hard enough to make it believe we're more dangerous than it is." John nodded, his mind racing. He glanced at the small collection of tools and supplies in the outpost. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. Preparing the trap, John began to work, improvising a trap with the limited resources at hand. He rigged a makeshift explosive using the outpost's emergency power cells and some chemical supplies he found earlier. It wasn't much, but it might be enough to stun the creature. Meanwhile, Lyra struggled to her feet, her movements slow and unsteady. "What are you doing?" John asked, glancing at her. "I'm not sitting here while you fight," she said, her voice firm despite her weakened state. "I can still help." John wanted to argue but saw the determination in her glowing eyes. "Fine," he said, "but stay close to me. We can't afford to get separated." Together, they prepared for the creature's inevitable return. John positioned the explosive near the entrance, hiding it under a pile of debris. Lyra used her remaining strength to create a diversion, a glowing lure made from the remnants of her energy field, designed to draw the predator into the trap. "Once it's inside, we detonate," John explained. "If we're lucky, it'll either kill it or slow it down enough for us to finish the job. Lyra nodded. And if it doesn't work? John's lips pressed into a thin line. Then we improvise. The predators return. As if on cue, a deep, resonant growl echoed through the storm. The outpost walls shuddered under the force of the sound, and the faint vibrations of heavy footsteps grew louder. "It's here," Lyra whispered. John positioned himself behind the cover of a metal console, his rifle aimed at the entrance. Lyra stood beside him, her dimly glowing form a shadow of her former brilliance. The door creaked, and the predator's massive shadow loomed in the narrow window. Its glowing red eyes scanned the interior, and its long, clawed fingers scraped against the metal walls. John's heart pounded in his chest as he tightened his grip on the rifle. "Come on, you bastard," he muttered under his breath. The door burst open with a deafening crash, and the predator lunged inside. Its massive form filled the room, its black fur bristling with unnatural energy. "Now," John shouted. Lyra activated the glowing lure, the sudden burst of light drawing the predator's attention. It snarled and charged toward the decoy, its powerful claws tearing through the debris. John hit the detonator. The explosion rocked the outpost, a blinding flash of light and heat engulfing the predator. The force of the blast threw John and Lyra backward, slamming them into the wall. When the smoke cleared, John scrambled to his feet, coughing as he tried to see through the haze. The predator lay sprawled in the center of the room, its body smoking and motionless. "Is it dead?" he asked, his voice trembling. Lyra stepped forward cautiously, her glowing eyes narrowing as she examined the creature. "No," she said grimly. "It's still breathing." The final blow. The predator stirred, its massive body twitching as it began to rise. John raised his rifle, but Lyra stopped him with a hand on his arm. "This is my fight," she said, her voice filled with quiet resolve. John hesitated but nodded, stepping back to give her space. Lyra drew herself up to her full height, her glowing scales flaring brighter than they had in hours. She placed her hands on the predator's head, her energy rippling through her body like a wave. The creature snarled, its red eyes locking onto hers. For a moment, it seemed like it might overpower her. But Lyra's glow intensified, a blinding light that filled the room. The predator let out a final, anguished roar before collapsing, its body going limp. Lyra stumbled backward, her glow fading as she fell into John's arms. "It's done," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Aftermath. The storm outside had finally passed, leaving the outpost bathed in a pale, silvery light. John sat beside Lyra, her head resting against his shoulder. She was weak but alive, her glowing eyes flickering faintly. "You saved us," John said, his voice soft. "We saved each other," Lyra replied with a faint smile. The silence between them was comforting, a stark contrast to the chaos of the past few days. As they waited for rescue, John couldn't help but feel a strange sense of connection to the alien woman beside him. "Do you think your people will come for you?" he asked. Lyra closed her eyes, a peaceful expression crossing her face. "Eventually. But for now, I'm content to stay here. With you." John chuckled softly. "Well, I hope you don't mind roughing it. This place isn't exactly 5-star accommodations." She smiled, her glowing eyes meeting his. "It's enough." And as the sun rose over the frozen wilderness of Aurora 5, John realized that, against all odds, they had both found something worth fighting for, something neither of them had expected.